El Salvador is a small country. It's the smallest in Central America, but it had a lot of people. More people than its land could really support well. The land was good for farming, especially coffee. But a few rich families, called the 14 families, owned most of it. This meant many regular Salvadorans had no land. They were poor, they had trouble finding work, life was hard for them. Right next door was Honduras. Honduras was much bigger. It had a lot more open land. Not as many people lived there compared to its size. So, for a long time, Salvadorans looked to Honduras. It seemed like a place where they could find a fresh start. They could get some land, maybe farm it, and build a better life. So, many Salvadorans moved across the border into Honduras. This migration wasn't new. It had been happening for decades. It was a slow, steady stream of people looking for opportunity. At first, it wasn't a big deal. The border was pretty open. People moved back and forth. They set up farms, they settled in, they became part of Honduran communities. But over time, things changed. More and more Salvadorans came. By the 1960s, a lot of them were living in Honduras. Estimates say maybe 300,000 Salvadorans lived there. That was a big number for Honduras. It made up a significant part of their population. This started to cause problems. Hondurans began to feel like their land was being taken. They saw Salvadorans as outsiders. They worried about jobs. They worried about resources. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about national identity. There was a feeling that Salvadorans were getting an unfair advantage, and some Honduran politicians used these feelings. They blamed Salvadorans for Honduras's problems. It was an easy target. The land issue was at the heart of it. Honduras had a lot of unused land, right? But much of it was technically owned by large banana companies like the United Fruit Company or by wealthy Hondurans. But many Salvadoran farmers just started working plots of this land. They cleared it. They planted crops, they made it productive. This was often done without official papers. It was informal, but they had been there for years, sometimes generations. They saw it as their land. The Honduran government, trying to address poverty among its own citizens, started a land reform program in the mid-1960s. The idea was to give land to poor Honduran farmers. But where would this land come from? Many politicians looked at the land farmed by Salvadoran immigrants. They saw it as an easy solution. If they took that land back, they could give it to Hondurans. This felt like a way to kill two birds with one stone, help Honduran farmers, and address the Salvadoran problem. This created a lot of fear and resentment among Salvadorans in Honduras. They had worked hard. They had built lives. Now, they were told they might lose everything. They were living in a country that increasingly didn't want them. The Honduran government started making it harder for Salvadorans to get legal residency. They started talking about expelling them. This was a huge threat. It meant many people could lose their homes, their farms, their entire way of life. The two countries also had an old border dispute. The exact line between them wasn't fully agreed upon. There were parts of the border that were unclear. This kind of dispute is common between neighboring countries. But when other tensions rise, these old disputes become more important. They become symbols of bigger disagreements. Neither country really trusted the other. The border issue was just another layer of friction. There were also economic tensions. El Salvador was more industrialized than Honduras. Salvadoran businesses often had an edge. They sold more goods to Honduras than they bought from Honduras. This trade imbalance felt unfair to Hondurans. They saw El Salvador as economically dominant, taking advantage of them. The Central American Common Market, which was supposed to bring the region together, actually made some of these imbalances worse. It felt like El Salvador was winning and Honduras was losing. So, by the late 1960s, the relationship between El Salvador and Honduras was very bad. It wasn't just about a few disagreements, it was a deep sense of mistrust and animosity. There were issues of land, immigration, economics, and national pride. People on both sides felt strongly. As Hondurans felt their land was being invaded, their jobs threatened, Salvadorans felt they were being scapegoated, their rights ignored. The governments of both countries were also under pressure. The Honduran government needed to show it was strong. It needed to address the concerns of its own poor farmers. The Salvadoran government had its own problems. It faced internal dissent. It needed to show it could protect its citizens, even those living abroad. Both governments used the situation to rally their people. They made the other country out to be the enemy. This made things much worse. It was like a pressure cooker. All these problems were building up. The lid was slowly tightening. People were angry. They were scared. They were looking for something to release that pressure. They were looking for a spark. It just needed one event, something dramatic to set everything off. No one knew what that spark would be, but everyone felt the tension in the air. The region was a powder keg, waiting for a match. This was the scene when the World Cup qualifiers began. Football, a game loved by millions, was about to step onto this very dangerous stage. No one could have predicted just how much it would change everything. The game was supposed to be a distraction. Instead, it became the point of no return. It focused all the simmering hatred into one intense moment. And then it broke. The year was 1969. The whole world was getting ready for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. For countries like El Salvador and Honduras, qualifying for the World Cup was a huge deal. It was a chance for national glory. It was a way to show pride. These weren't just games. They were symbols. They were battles on a different kind of field. El Salvador and Honduras were drawn to play each other in the qualifying rounds. It was a two-leg playoff. The winner would go on to the next round. This was already a high-stakes situation for any two countries. But for El Salvador and Honduras, with all the bad blood between them, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Everyone knew it wouldn't just be about soccer. The first match was on June 8th, 1969. It was played in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. The atmosphere was incredibly hostile. The days before the game, Salvadoran fans traveling to Honduras faced harassment. Their cars were vandalized. They were insulted. The air was thick with anger and resentment, not just sports rivalry. When game day came, the tension exploded. Salvadoran players and fans were terrorized. The Honduran mobs surrounded their hotel. They threw rocks at windows, they banged on pots and pans all night trying to keep the Salvadoran team from sleeping. It was a deliberate act to intimidate them. It wasn't just about winning a game. It was about showing dominance. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere was even worse. Salvadoran flags were burned. The Salvadoran national anthem was booed loudly. It was an assault on their national pride. The Honduran fans were whipped into a frenzy. They saw the Salvadoran team as representatives of everything. They resented the immigrants, the economic imbalance, the perceived arrogance. The game itself was a nightmare for El Salvador. They lost 1-0. But the loss wasn't the biggest story. The violence was. After the match, things got even uglier. Salvadoran fans were attacked as they left the stadium. Their cars were set on fire. Several people were seriously injured. 2 Salvadoran fans were killed. It was horrific. It wasn't just a soccer riot. It felt like an attack on a nation. The news of the violence in Tegucigalpa reached El Salvador quickly. The country was outraged. People felt a deep sense of injustice and anger. The Salvadoran government immediately protested to Honduras. They called for international intervention. They accused Honduras of not providing adequate security. They demanded explanations and apologies. One young Salvadoran girl, Amelia Bolanos, was so upset by what happened that she died of a heart attack. Her funeral became a massive public event. The Salvadoran media played it up. They used her story to fuel nationalistic fervor. They painted Honduras as a brutal, barbaric country. They called for revenge. The atmosphere in El Salvador became incredibly charged. People wanted payback. Just a week later, on June 15th, it was time for the second leg. This time, the game was in San Salvador, El Salvador. The roles were reversed. Now it was the Hondurans who were coming into a hostile environment. The Salvadoran government had to provide security, but the public mood was dangerous. Salvadoran fans were ready. They wanted to return the favor. The violence that had happened in Tegucigalpa was fresh in everyone's minds. Honduran fans and the team faced the same kind of terror and intimidation. Their hotel was surrounded. Their bus was attacked. The same kind of rocks and insults were hurled. It was a mirror image of the first game, but perhaps even more intense because of the deaths in Honduras. Inside the stadium in San Salvador, the scene was similar to the first match. Honduran flags were burned. Their anthem was booed. The Honduran team played under immense pressure. El Salvador won the game convincingly, 3-0. This win made the aggregate score 3-1 for El Salvador, meaning they advanced, but just like the first game, the score was almost secondary to the violence. After the match, the attacks on Hondurans escalated. Honduran-owned businesses were targeted. Their cars were burned, people were assaulted, more lives were lost. Honduran reports claim more than 100 of their citizens were killed or injured. Salvadoran mobs attacked Honduran immigrants living in El Salvador, not just the visiting fans. It was a chaotic, brutal scene. The scale of the violence was shocking. It wasn't just a few hooligans. It was widespread. It involved many people. It was fueled by years of pent-up anger and resentment. The soccer matches had become a lightning rod. They had concentrated all the existing tensions into 2 intense days of nationalist fury. The diplomatic relations between the two countries broke down completely. El Salvador expelled Honduran diplomats. Honduras did the same. Both countries started recalling their ambassadors. The Central American Common Market, which was supposed to foster peace and trade, became completely irrelevant. The idea of regional cooperation seemed laughable. The governments used the events to justify their positions, which El Salvador spoke of protecting its citizens from Honduran barbarism. Honduras spoke of defending its sovereignty from Salvadoran aggression and immigration. The media in both countries poured fuel on the fire. Newspapers screamed headlines of atrocities. Radio stations played patriotic music and rallied people against the enemy. The situation was spiraling out of control. It wasn't just about soccer anymore. It was about national pride, about protecting citizens, about old grievances coming to a head. The matches had simply been the trigger. They had provided a public emotional outlet for all the underlying issues. No one could ignore it now. The violence had been too widespread, the deaths too many. Both nations felt deeply wronged, and both were ready to take further action. The war drum started beating. After the two brutal soccer matches, the situation got much worse very quickly. The violence at the stadiums was just the beginning. The real crisis began when the Honduran government started to act against Salvadoran immigrants living in their country. Honduras had already been talking about land reform. They had been eyeing the land farmed by Salvadorans. The soccer war provided the perfect excuse. The Honduran government began a systematic campaign to expel Salvadorans. They claimed these Salvadorans were illegal. They said they were a threat to national security. This was a clear message: get out. Thousands of Salvadorans were targeted, their farms were taken, their homes were destroyed. They were attacked by Honduran mobs. Sometimes these mobs were encouraged by local authorities or landowners who wanted the land. Salvadoran families, many of whom had lived in Honduras for decades, were forced to leave everything behind. They had no choice. It was either leave or face further violence, maybe even death. The Salvadorans fled back across the border into El Salvador. They arrived in droves. They were often injured, traumatized, and had lost all their possessions. They told horrific stories of beatings, rapes, and murder. These stories were picked up by the Salvadoran media. They fueled the public's anger even more. The returning refugees were a visible, undeniable sign of Honduran aggression. El Salvador, already a small and densely populated country, struggled to cope with this sudden influx of its own people. These were not just a few hundred, these were tens of thousands. The government had to find places for them to live, food to eat, and medical care. It put a huge strain on resources, and it created a powerful emotional narrative. The Salvadoran government could point to these refugees and say, "Look what Honduras is doing to our people." The diplomatic efforts to calm things down completely failed. The Organization of American States OAS tried to mediate. They sent envoys, they held meetings, but neither side was willing to back down. El Salvador demanded compensation for its expelled citizens. It demanded guarantees for those who remained. It demanded an end to the violence. Honduras refused. It said the Salvadorans were illegal aliens. Well, it said they were a threat to their own land reform. Both countries had deep grievances. El Salvador felt its people were being massacred and expelled. Honduras felt its sovereignty was being undermined by illegal immigration and economic dominance. The mutual accusations were flying back and forth. No one was listening. Each side felt completely justified in its stance. The rhetoric from both governments and their media became increasingly inflammatory. In El Salvador, newspapers ran stories almost daily about Honduran atrocities. They called for military action to protect their brothers and sisters in Honduras. They talked about avenging the dead and defending national honor. In Honduras, the media portrayed El Salvador as an aggressive, overpopulated nation trying to invade their territory and steal their land. The military in both countries started to mobilize. This wasn't subtle. Troops were moved closer to the border. The reserves were called up, weapons were prepared. The talk wasn't about peace anymore. It was about war. Both sides were convinced that the other was planning an attack. This created a dangerous cycle of fear and preparation. El Salvador, with its smaller territory and high population density, felt particularly vulnerable. Its military leaders believed they had to act decisively. They saw the expulsion of Salvadorans as an act of war. They felt they had to defend their national interests and their people, even if it meant striking first. The government was under immense public pressure. People were chanting, "Guerra, guerra, war, war." And Honduras, on the other hand, felt provoked. They saw El Salvador's military preparations as a threat. They felt they needed to defend their borders and their land from what they viewed as an aggressive neighbor. The military leaders also used the situation to consolidate power and rally nationalist sentiment. The armies of both countries were not exactly superpowers. They were relatively small, equipped mostly with older American and Israeli weapons. Their air forces were small, made up mostly of propeller-driven P-51 Mustangs and F-4U Corsairs from World War II. But for them, these were serious fighting machines. The border, which had been a fluid line for generations, now became a hard boundary. Military patrols increased, skirmishes broke out, shots were fired. These weren't isolated incidents. They were happening more often, the tension was palpable, everyone knew it was just a matter of time. The international community watched with growing alarm. The OAS tried its best, but its efforts were largely ignored. The mutual hatred had gone too deep. The grievances were too raw. Both governments were too invested in their positions. They had painted themselves into a corner. War seemed inevitable. It wasn't just about the soccer matches anymore. Those games were just a visible sign of the deep-seated problems, but they had served a purpose. They had brought all those problems to the surface in a dramatic, emotional way. They had created the conditions where normal diplomacy became impossible. They had pushed the people and the governments to a point of no return. The stage was set. The military machines were revving up. The world held its breath, wondering when, not if, the first full-scale attack would come. It was a dark time for Central America. On July 14th, 1969, the war finally started. It was almost exactly 1 month after the last soccer match. At around 5:50 p.m., the Salvadoran military launched a full-scale invasion of Honduras. They didn't declare war first, they just attacked. El Salvador's army crossed the border in several places. They moved quickly. Their main goal was to capture key Honduran towns and the main highway that ran through Honduras. This highway was important because it connected Honduras' two main cities, Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula. It also connected Honduras to the sea. If El Salvador could control it, they could effectively cut Honduras in half. The Salvadoran military had a plan. They thought they could win quickly. They had a slight advantage in terms of ground troops and air support. Their small air force, made up of those old World War II planes, was active right away. They bombed Honduran airfields and military targets. They wanted to knock out Honduras' ability to fight back from the air. This was one of the few times in history that propeller-driven planes were used in combat against each other in such a way. The Honduran military was caught a bit off guard by the speed and scale of the attack, but they quickly mobilized. Their own small air force, also made up of vintage planes, retaliated. Here, they bombed Salvadoran targets, including the Ilopango airport near San Salvador. And dogfights, where these old planes battled in the sky, became a feature of the conflict. It was like something out of an old movie, but it was very real for the pilots involved. On the ground, Salvadoran troops pushed into Honduran territory. They faced resistance, but initially they made good progress. They captured several border towns. The fighting was intense. Soldiers on both sides were fighting for their country, fueled by the nationalist anger that had been building for months. The war lasted just 4 days. It's often called the 100-hour war because of how short it was. But even in those 4 days, a lot of damage was done. Many people died. The fighting was fierce, especially in the border areas. Both sides used infantry, artillery, and their small air forces. The ground battles were tough. Salvadoran forces advanced, but Honduran forces dug in and defended their territory. Civilian populations in the border areas were hit hard. They were caught in the middle of the fighting. Many were displaced, their homes were destroyed, the casualties started to mount up. Exact numbers are always hard to confirm in a short, intense conflict like this, but estimates suggest thousands of people died. Most of them were civilians. Perhaps 2,000 people, maybe even more, lost their lives. That's a huge number for such a short war between two relatively small countries. And many more were injured. The international community reacted quickly. The Organization of American States OAS was already trying to mediate before the war. When the invasion happened, they stepped up their efforts. They condemned El Salvador's actions. They called for an immediate ceasefire. They pressured both countries to stop fighting. The OAS deployed a mission to the region. They worked to get both sides to agree to a truce. They threatened economic sanctions against El Salvador if it didn't withdraw its troops. The pressure was immense. After 4 days of fighting, on July 18th, El Salvador agreed to a ceasefire. But they refused to withdraw their troops immediately. They said they would only pull back once Honduras guaranteed the safety of Salvadorans still living in Honduras. They wanted assurances that the violence against their people would stop, and that expelled Salvadorans could return. This became a major sticking point. Honduras, for its part, demanded that El Salvador withdraw its troops unconditionally. They saw the invasion as a clear act of aggression and refused to negotiate under duress. The ceasefire was fragile. Tensions remained incredibly high. Even though the main fighting stopped, there were still skirmishes along the border. Both armies remained in position, wary of the other. The war had shown just how volatile the situation was. It had shown how quickly deep-seated political and economic problems could explode into open conflict, especially when fueled by intense nationalism and media hype. The soccer matches had not been the cause of the war, but they had been the critical trigger. They had provided the emotional justification, the spark that ignited the powder keg. Even after the ceasefire, the wounds were deep. The mistrust was stronger than ever. Thousands of people were dead or displaced. The economies of both countries were damaged. And the underlying issues of land, immigration, and border disputes remained unresolved. The short war was over, but the peace was far from secure. The aftermath would be long and complicated. It would take years, even decades, to sort out the mess created by those 4 brutal days. The war might have stopped, but the conflict had changed everything between El Salvador and Honduras forever. The fighting stopped after 4 days, but the war wasn't truly over. It took a long time for things to settle down, and some issues lingered for decades. The ceasefire in July 1969 was just the beginning of a very difficult peace process. El Salvador refused to withdraw its troops from Honduran territory for a long time. They insisted that Honduras first guarantee the safety and rights of Salvadoran immigrants. Honduras refused to negotiate while its territory was occupied. The OAS had to step in again, putting more pressure on El Salvador. Eventually, in early August, El Salvador agreed to withdraw its forces. They did so mainly because the OAS threatened to impose sanctions. Even after the troops pulled back, diplomatic relations didn't resume immediately. The border remained closed. Trade between the two countries stopped completely. This was a big blow to both economies, especially because they were part of the Central American Common Market. That market was effectively destroyed by the war. It took years for it to recover, and it never quite returned to its previous level of integration. The human cost of the war was immense. As mentioned, thousands of people died, mostly civilians. Many more were injured. Tens of thousands of Salvadoran immigrants were displaced. They lost their homes, their farms, their livelihoods in Honduras. They became refugees in their own country, putting a huge strain on El Salvador's already limited resources. This created long-term social and economic problems for El Salvador. The underlying issues that had led to the war were still there. The land dispute, the immigration problem, the economic imbalance, none of these were solved by the fighting. In fact, the war made them worse. The border remained largely undefined in many areas, a constant source of tension. It took over 10 years for El Salvador and Honduras to sign a peace treaty. That treaty, called the General Peace Treaty, was finally signed in Lima, Peru on October 30th, 1980. It formally ended the state of war between the two countries, but even then, it didn't fully resolve all the border issues. The most contentious parts of the border dispute were referred to the International Court of Justice (ICJ) in The Hague. This was a slow process. It took another 12 years for the ICJ to issue its ruling. In 1992, the court made its final decision on the disputed land and maritime boundaries. It finally drew clear lines, giving some disputed territories to El Salvador and others to Honduras. Both countries accepted the ICJ ruling. This was a huge step towards fully normalizing relations. It showed that even after a war, it was possible to resolve complex issues through international law and diplomacy, though it took a very long time. But the legacy of the war wasn't just about borders. It deepened the sense of nationalism in both countries. It made their populations more aware of national identity and sovereignty. It also highlighted the fragility of peace in the region and the dangers of using external conflicts to distract from internal problems. For El Salvador, the influx of returning refugees only intensified its existing problems with land scarcity and poverty. This contributed to social unrest, which eventually played a role in the much longer and bloodier Salvadoran Civil War 1979 to 1992. The football war was a short, sharp conflict, but its effects rippled through the region for decades. The war is a stark reminder that sports, even something as beloved as soccer, can be more than just a game. When played against a backdrop of deep-seated political, economic, and social tensions, a match can become a focal point for nationalistic fervor and can trigger real-world violence. The soccer matches didn't cause the war. The war had roots in decades of disputes over land, immigration, and economic imbalance. But the matches provided the emotional spark, the public stage where all that anger and resentment could boil over. It taught a bitter lesson about how easily public opinion can be manipulated, how quickly nationalist sentiment can override reason, and how dangerous it is when governments use external enemies to distract from internal problems. The so-called football war was a tragedy. It showed the world that even a simple game could, under the wrong circumstances, become a preamble to battle. It was a stark warning, etched into the history of Central America, about the real-world consequences of unaddressed tensions and unchecked national pride. The echoes of those 4 intense days of fighting, and the decades of disputes before and after, serve as a reminder of how crucial it is for nations to manage their differences peacefully, no matter how passionate the game.